He thought he was dragging out a helpless old woman, but in less than 10 minutes, the entire department would learn the truth he never bothered to see. The automatic doors of the Maple Ridge pharmacy slid open with a harsh mechanical hiss, and the cold evening air rushed inside as Officer Ryan Mercer stepped backward onto the sidewalk, one hand clamped around the arm of an elderly black woman whose coat had nearly slipped from her shoulders. Her name was Evelyn Brooks, 72 years old, barely 5'3", with silver curls tucked beneath a navy church hat and a wooden cane now lying several feet away on the concrete as if it too had been discarded without a second thought. The orange glow of the parking lot lights stretched across the pavement, catching the fallen contents of her paper bag one by one. A bottle of heart medication, a pair of reading glasses, a receipt folded in half, and a birthday card decorated with bright blue balloons. For a moment, nobody moved. Not the cashier standing just inside the door with her mouth half open. Not the young father loading groceries into the trunk of his SUV. Not the woman near the Redbox machine who had already raised her phone but still hadn't decided whether to speak or just record. Evelyn did not scream. She did not beg. She only stared straight ahead, her breathing shallow, one gloved hand trembling at her side, as if she were trying to hold on to the last piece of dignity the moment had not yet stolen from her. Ryan stood over her with the stiff confidence of a man who had worn authority too long and humanity not long enough. In his mind, this was simple. A disturbance. A refusal to cooperate. Another person he believed didn't belong where she was. His radio crackled at his shoulder, but he ignored it. The silence around him felt easier to control. "You should have listened the first time," he said, loud enough for everyone in the lot to hear. And that was what made it worse. Not just the accusation, but the performance of it. The way public humiliation can spread faster than truth. Imagine standing there at 72 years old, your medicine on the ground, your cane out of reach, while strangers study your face like they're waiting for you to prove whether you deserve kindness. Evelyn slowly turned her eyes toward the items scattered at her feet, and when she saw the birthday card lying face up against the curb, something in her expression changed. Not fear, not panic, just hurt, deep and tired. Like this was not the first time someone had looked at her and decided they already knew the story. Inside the pharmacy, someone whispered that maybe the officer had a reason. Outside, another voice muttered that old people could be difficult. But no one there knew that the woman on that sidewalk had spent her whole life raising a son to believe a badge was supposed to protect people, not shame them. No one knew that a single image tucked inside her wallet, if it had landed face up instead of face down, would have frozen the entire scene. And Ryan Mercer, with his jaw set and his hand still tied around Evelyn Brooks's arm, had absolutely no idea that the woman he had chosen to disgrace under those parking lot lights was the mother of the man who ran the whole department. The cold did not come all at once that evening. It crept in slowly, settling over Maple Ridge like a thin sheet of glass, turning the pharmacy windows into pale mirrors and the parking lot into a stage no one had meant to stand on. Evelyn Brooks remained near the curb, steadying herself with one hand against the side of a newspaper box while her eyes stayed fixed on the few things that had spilled from her bag. The bottle of pills had rolled to the painted edge of the handicap space. Her reading glasses rested upside down beside the birthday card, one arm slightly bent. A silver cough drop tin had popped open, scattering 2 wrapped lozenges near the front tire of a pickup truck. Small things. Ordinary things. The kind of things that tell you everything about a person if you are willing to look. Officer Ryan Mercer was not looking. He stood with the same rigid posture, shoulders squared, jaw tight, as though the whole moment depended on him never softening. Inside the pharmacy, fluorescent lights buzzed over half-stock shelves and a seasonal display of Easter candy that no one was paying attention to anymore. The cashier, a woman in her early 20s named Marisol, kept glancing between Evelyn and the store manager, unsure whether she should speak or stay silent. The manager had made the call to report a possible shoplifting concern after Evelyn hesitated at the register, searching through a coin purse with unsteady fingers while trying to ask a question about a discount card. That was all it took. A pause too long. A voice too soft. A look from the wrong person at the wrong time. Sometimes injustice does not begin with hatred shouted out loud. Sometimes it begins with impatience, with assumptions, with the quiet decision that someone else is a problem before they have even been heard. Evelyn slowly bent at the waist, wincing as she reached for the birthday card. But before her hand could touch it, a teenage girl in a maroon hoodie stepped forward from the sidewalk and picked it up for her. "Here, ma'am," she said gently, her voice the first one all evening that sounded human. Evelyn looked at her and offered a faint smile, the kind that carried gratitude and embarrassment at the same time. "Thank you, baby," she said, then took the card carefully, smoothing the corner with her thumb as if that small act of tenderness might repair more than bent paper. Ryan noticed the exchange, but said nothing. His attention had already shifted back to his own version of events, the one where procedure excused everything and pride could not afford to blink. He asked Evelyn again whether she planned to cooperate, but even his words now sounded thinner, less certain, because the crowd had changed. It was subtle. A man by the gas pump stopped pretending to scroll on his phone and started watching with concern. An older woman in a quilted jacket stepped out of her sedan and frowned. The silence was no longer empty. It was beginning to judge. Evelyn lifted her chin and finally spoke, her voice quiet, but clear enough to cut through the hum of idling engines and the rustle of winter coats. "Young man," she said, "I came here for my medicine and a birthday card for my grandson. I have told you that 3 times. Ryan's expression hardened, but there was something unsettled beneath it now, something almost defensive. He had expected fear. He had expected confusion. What he had not expected was calm, because calm has a way of making wrongdoing look exactly like what it is. And somewhere just beyond the glow of the parking lot lights, a black city vehicle had already turned onto the service road, heading straight toward the pharmacy. The city vehicle moved without sirens, without flashing lights, without any of the noise people usually associate with power, and somehow that made its arrival feel even heavier. It rolled into the pharmacy lot with a low engine hum and stopped beneath the washed-out glow of the overhead lamps, where every face in the crowd turned at once. Officer Ryan Mercer noticed it immediately. His posture shifted, not much, just enough for a trained eye to catch it. One foot moved back. One hand dropped from his belt. The certainty that had wrapped around him all evening began to loosen, thread by thread. Evelyn Brooks saw the vehicle too, but her expression did not change. She still stood near the curb with that same tired grace, one hand holding the birthday card against her coat, the other resting lightly on the metal newspaper box as if she had decided that dignity, once claimed, would not be surrendered again. The driver's side door opened first. A tall man stepped out wearing a dark wool overcoat over his uniform, broad-shouldered, composed, the kind of man who did not need to raise his voice for people to notice him. Chief Daniel Brooks had come straight from a budget meeting downtown, his tie slightly loosened, his radio clipped low, his face carrying the quiet strain of a long day that vanished the second his eyes landed on the woman near the curb. He did not rush at first. He took 2 measured steps forward, then stopped completely, as if his mind needed 1 extra second to reject what it was seeing. His mother's cane on the pavement, her medicine near the painted line, her glasses bent beside a tire, her coat wrinkled at the sleeve where someone had held on too tightly. And then he saw the card in her hand, a bright little thing with blue balloons on the front, and the look in her eyes was no longer confusion. It was heartbreak. "Mom," he said, and the single word changed the air more completely than any siren ever could. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Even the wind seemed to pull back. Ryan Mercer turned toward him so quickly it looked involuntary, and the color in his face drained in a way no one there would forget. The teenage girl in the maroon hoodie lowered her phone. The cashier inside the pharmacy pressed a hand to her mouth. Somewhere in the distance, a shopping cart rolled loose across the lot and tapped gently against a curb, a small, lonely sound in a moment that suddenly felt enormous. Daniel crossed the space between them with controlled steps, his eyes never leaving Evelyn. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice low, careful, nothing like the kind of voice a man uses when he is only speaking to an officer or a witness. This was a son speaking to his mother in front of strangers who had watched her stand alone too long. Evelyn gave the smallest nod, but her fingers tightened around the birthday card. "I am fine," she said softly, and then after the briefest pause she added, "I just wanted to get your son something nice for tomorrow." Daniel closed his eyes for half a second, and when he opened them again, something colder had settled behind them. Not rage, not spectacle. Something worse for the man standing 10 feet away. Professional clarity. He bent down, picked up her cane with both hands, and placed it back in her grasp as carefully as if he were returning a sacred object. Then he straightened and finally looked at Officer Ryan Mercer. It was not the look of a man discovering a mistake. It was the look of a man identifying a failure. "Officer," Daniel said, his tone calm enough to make every person in the lot lean in without meaning to. "Explain to me why my mother is standing outside in the cold without her medicine while half this parking lot watches." Ryan opened his mouth, but for the first time that evening, authority did not come when he called for it. Ryan Mercer tried to gather himself, but the moment had already slipped out of his control. He cleared his throat once, then again, as though a better version of the story might arrive if he gave it one more second. "Chief, I responded to a report from the store manager," he said, keeping his voice formal, careful, almost rehearsed. "Possible shoplifting concern. Subject appeared uncooperative. I was attempting to resolve the situation." Daniel Brooks did not interrupt him. That silence was worse than any raised voice. It forced every word to stand on its own, exposed and weak beneath the parking lot lights. Evelyn stood beside her son now, one hand resting on the cane he had returned to her, the other still holding the card meant for her grandson. She looked smaller than she had inside his memory, and somehow that made the sight harder to bear. Daniel glanced once at the scattered medicine on the ground, then toward the pharmacy entrance where the manager had finally stepped outside, his red tie crooked, his expression already wavering under the pressure of being seen too clearly. "Resolve the situation," Daniel repeated, not as a question, not even as an accusation, but as if he were testing the weight of the phrase and finding it empty. The manager shifted from one foot to the other. Marisol, the cashier, stood a few feet behind him with her store apron still on, gripping her name tag between two nervous fingers. The teenage girl in the maroon hoodie remained near the curb, not leaving, not pretending she had not witnessed any of it. The crowd had thickened by then, drawn in by the city vehicle, the stillness, the sense that something larger than a routine misunderstanding was unfolding in plain view. Daniel turned toward the manager. "Did my mother leave the store with unpaid items?" he asked. The man blinked, swallowed, and shook his head. "No, sir. Not exactly. It was more that there was confusion at the register, and then she seemed upset, and I thought it would be better to call." Daniel held his gaze. "So that is a no." The manager's face tightened. "Yes, sir. No unpaid merchandise left the store." That answer moved through the lot like a cold wind. Ryan's shoulders stiffened. He began to speak again, but Daniel raised one hand just slightly, and the officer stopped. Not out of courtesy, out of instinct. "Marisol," Daniel said, reading the name on her tag. "Were you at the register?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir." "Tell me what happened." Her eyes darted to Ryan, then back to Evelyn, and for a moment it seemed fear might win. Then she looked at the bottle of pills near the curb, and something in her settled. "She was counting change, sir." She asked whether the store card would still work if she had left hers at home. "I told her we could use her phone number." She could not remember which number the account was under, and she looked embarrassed. Then Mr. Harlan came up and asked if there was a problem. She said she just needed a minute. That is when he called. Daniel's expression did not change, but the air around him did. It became still in a sharper way, the way a courtroom feels right before a ruling lands. Imagine standing there and realizing the entire story was built on nothing but impatience, pride, and the refusal to treat an elderly woman like she deserved even 30 extra seconds. Evelyn lowered her eyes to the birthday card and gently brushed her thumb across the blue balloons on the front. "I kept telling them I had the money," she said quietly. "I just needed a moment to find the right pocket." Daniel looked at her, and the pain that crossed his face was brief but unmistakable. Then he turned back to Ryan Mercer, whose badge suddenly seemed less like authority and more like borrowed metal. "Officer," Daniel said, calm as winter glass, "did you ask a single question before deciding who she was?" Ryan Mercer did not answer right away. He looked past Daniel Brooks, toward the pharmacy windows, toward the manager, toward the handful of strangers who had become witnesses, as if one of them might hand him a version of the moment that sounded cleaner than the truth. But truth has a way of standing still when everything else begins to shift. "I acted on the information I was given," he said at last, his voice lower now, stripped of the sharp edge it carried only minutes earlier. "I believe there was a situation developing, and I made a judgment call." Daniel held his gaze for a long second, then bent down and picked up the bottle of heart medication from the asphalt. He turned it slowly in his hand, reading the label before offering it back to his mother with a tenderness that made the whole parking lot feel ashamed of itself. Evelyn accepted it carefully and slipped it into her coat pocket, though her fingers were still trembling just enough for Daniel to notice. He noticed everything. The way she favored one leg now, the bent arm of her reading glasses, the strain around her mouth where she had been swallowing hurt instead of speaking it. He had spent years learning how to read crime scenes, reports, body language, small fractures in a story. Tonight he did not need training to see what had happened. He only needed eyes and the willingness to use them. "A judgment call," Daniel repeated quietly. That is a powerful phrase when it is used to excuse a lack of patience. Ryan shifted his weight, but said nothing. The manager, Mr. Harlan, took one uncertain step forward and offered a tight, nervous smile that disappeared almost instantly under Daniel's expression. "Chief, if I may, I think this has all gotten a little blown out of proportion," he said. "Everyone is upset, and perhaps we can clear up the misunderstanding privately." Daniel turned toward him with a calm that felt sharper than anger. "Privately," he said. "Was it handled privately when my mother was left standing out here in the cold while people watched?" Mr. Harlan opened his mouth, then closed it again. Marisol lowered her eyes. The teenage girl in the maroon hoodie folded her arms tighter across her chest, as though she had already heard too many adults use soft words to cover hard things. Daniel looked around the lot, taking in the silent witnesses, the phones now lowered but not forgotten, the older woman by the sedan shaking her head in disbelief, the father near the sport utility vehicle who had stopped loading groceries altogether. "This is how it happens," Daniel said, not loudly, but clearly enough that everyone heard him. Not always with shouting. Not always with obvious cruelty. Sometimes it happens because someone decides an elderly woman asking for a minute is a threat instead of a person. No one challenged him. No one could. Evelyn drew in a careful breath and looked up at her son. "Daniel," she said softly, the way only a mother can say a grown man's name and make him sound 10 years old again, "do not turn into them." The words landed gently, but they carried weight. Daniel's face shifted, not into weakness, but into discipline. She was reminding him of who he was, and who she had raised him to be. He nodded once. Then he reached down and picked up her reading glasses from the ground. One arm was bent out of place. He studied them for a second, then looked at Ryan. "Did you see these?" he asked. Ryan frowned, unsure how to respond. Daniel held the glasses up between two fingers. "Did you see her medication? Her cane? The birthday card in the parking lot? Did any of that tell you to slow down?" The question hung there, unanswered, because some questions do not require a reply to reveal everything. Off to one side, another patrol unit eased into the lot, followed by a second city sedan. Word had spread. A uniformed lieutenant stepped out, then stopped cold when he recognized Daniel, Evelyn, and the shape of the scene. The department was arriving now, not with sirens, but with consequences. And Ryan Mercer, standing beneath those parking lot lights with every excuse growing smaller around him, was beginning to understand that the hardest part of the night had not been seeing who Evelyn Brooks was. It was realizing that everyone else now saw exactly who he was. The second patrol unit parked at an angle near the far end of the lot, followed by a dark gray city sedan that reflected the pharmacy lights in long pale streaks. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stepped out first, one hand on the open door, his expression shifting from routine concern to stunned recognition in less than a breath. He had worked under Chief Daniel Brooks for 4 years, long enough to know the chief's posture when a situation was serious and long enough to understand that the stillness in Daniel's face meant something far worse than anger. Behind Hale came Internal Affairs Captain Susan Keller, her coat buttoned high against the cold, a slim folder already tucked beneath one arm, as if instinct had brought her there before facts had even fully formed. Ryan Mercer saw her and swallowed hard. The parking lot seemed to contract around him. Moments earlier, it had been a place where he believed he could manage the narrative with a few clipped phrases and a badge on his chest. Now it had become something else entirely, a circle of witnesses, officers, store employees, and quiet eyes that were no longer willing to look away. Evelyn Brooks stood beside her son, her cane planted firmly now, her birthday card tucked against her coat like a small surviving piece of grace. The wind caught the edge of her scarf, and Marisol stepped forward with unexpected courage, gently lifting the fallen paper pharmacy bag from the ground and gathering the last loose items with shaking hands. She handed them to Evelyn without a word. Evelyn nodded, and in that small exchange there was more humanity than anyone had shown her when this began. Daniel looked at Marcus Hale, then at Captain Keller. "I want body camera footage preserved immediately," he said, his voice controlled. Even the voice of a man refusing to let pain outrun principle. "I want statements from everyone present, including store staff and civilian witnesses. No one leaves until names are documented." Ryan opened his mouth again. "Chief, with respect, I did what I thought was necessary based on the call." Daniel turned toward him slowly. "That sentence keeps getting smaller every time you use it." The words were not loud, but they landed with the clean force of truth. Captain Keller glanced once at Evelyn, once at the items gathered in her arms, then toward the bent reading glasses Daniel still held. "Officer Mercer," she said, her tone clipped and official, "do you have any reason the scene should not be formally reviewed?" Ryan's answer came late. "No, ma'am." He could feel it now, the unraveling. Not dramatic, not explosive, worse than that. Methodical, public, permanent. Imagine standing in the same place where you thought authority would protect you, only to realize that every silent witness has become part of the record. The teenage girl in the maroon hoodie stepped closer when Lieutenant Hale asked for names. "Tasha Reed," she said, lifting her chin. "I saw the whole thing. The father by the sport utility vehicle gave his name too. So did the older woman in the quilted jacket." One by one, the silence that had failed Evelyn was turning into testimony. Mr. Harlan, the store manager, wiped his hands on his slacks, already looking like a man searching for a future version of himself who could claim he had meant well. But intent is a weak shelter when harm has already stood in the cold. Daniel took a slow breath and looked at his mother. "Would you like to sit in the car?" he asked softly. Evelyn glanced around the parking lot, at the people watching, at the officers taking notes, at Ryan Mercer standing under the same lights that had made him look so sure of himself before. Then she shook her head. "No," she said, her voice calm and steady. "I have stood long enough for what was wrong. I can stand a little longer for what is right." Daniel looked at her for a moment, and something deep and quiet passed across his face, pride wrapped tightly around grief. Captain Keller began directing the scene with brisk efficiency. Hale moved to collect statements. Tasha pointed out where the cane had landed. Marisol described the register. And on the dark pavement near the painted handicap line, Daniel noticed one final item half tucked beneath the edge of Evelyn's fallen wallet. An old photograph, slightly creased, showing a younger Evelyn in Sunday blue standing beside a teenage boy in a junior police academy uniform, smiling like the future still meant honor. Daniel bent, picked it up, and stared at it for 1 second too long. Then he slipped it into his coat pocket, turned back toward Ryan Mercer, and the whole parking lot seemed to brace for what would come next. Daniel Brooks did not speak right away. He stood beneath the pharmacy lights with that old photograph resting inside his coat pocket. And for a moment, the only sounds in the parking lot were the scratch of Lieutenant Hale's pen, the low murmur of engines idling, and the brittle flutter of the store receipt in Evelyn's paper bag. Ryan Mercer remained where he was, though the confidence that had carried him through the evening had long since drained from his face. He looked less like an officer in command now, and more like a man waiting to hear whether the ground beneath him was about to give way. Captain Susan Keller had already begun directing the review with brisk precision, but even she seemed to understand that something larger than paperwork was unfolding in front of everyone. Daniel took one slow step toward Ryan, then another, not threatening, not dramatic, just deliberate, the way truth moves when it has no need to rush. "Officer Mercer," he said at last, and his voice was so level that the entire lot seemed to lean toward it. "I want you to listen very carefully, because what happens next will not be shaped by your assumptions, your discomfort, or your pride. It will be shaped by facts." Ryan nodded once, too quickly, as though agreement might protect him. Daniel continued, his eyes steady. "My mother is 72 years old. She came here for medication and a birthday card for her grandson. She asked for time. She offered an explanation. She posed no threat to this store, to you, or to anyone else in this parking lot. And yet somehow, tonight, she ended up standing in the cold without her medicine, without her cane, and without the basic respect any decent person should have shown her on instinct. Ryan drew in a breath. Chief, I understand how this looks. Daniel's expression did not move. No, he said softly. You understand how it feels now that the person you dismissed has a name that matters to you. Those words landed harder than anything else that night, because everyone in that lot knew they were true. The father by the sport utility vehicle looked down at the ground. Tasha Reed folded her arms tighter. Marisol blinked rapidly and pressed her lips together, as if fighting the shame of all the moments she had stayed quiet before speaking up. Evelyn herself said nothing. She simply stood with her cane and the birthday card, her silver curls touched by the light, her face carrying that same calm sorrow that had somehow become the most powerful thing in the entire scene. Imagine realizing that the person you thought could be brushed aside was not weak at all, only dignified enough not to become cruel in return. Daniel turned slightly toward Captain Keller. Effective immediately, he said. Officer Ryan Mercer is relieved of field duty pending full investigation. His body camera footage, dispatch log, and all written statements are to be secured tonight. I want store surveillance requested before the hour is up, and I want every witness statement attached before sunrise. Keller nodded without hesitation. Yes, Chief. Ryan's mouth parted in disbelief. Sir, with respect, this is excessive. Daniel looked at him then, really looked at him, and the disappointment in that gaze was far heavier than anger could have been. Excessive, Daniel repeated. My mother stood in a parking lot with her medicine on the pavement because no one here gave her 1 minute of grace. Do not talk to me about excessive. The words settled over the crowd like a final ruling. Lieutenant Hale stepped forward then, professional and quiet. Officer Mercer, I am going to need your unit keys. Ryan hesitated. It was brief, barely there, but everyone saw it. Then, slowly, he unclipped the keys from his belt and placed them in Hale's hand. The small metallic sound they made was almost nothing, yet it echoed through the lot with the weight of consequence. Evelyn watched the exchange with tired eyes, then turned to her son. Daniel, she said softly, do not let this be only about me. He looked at her, and she held his gaze with the steady authority only mothers seem to carry from one decade to the next. Make it about the next woman nobody bothers to believe, she said. And in that moment, under cold lights and silent witnesses, everyone there understood that the deepest power in the parking lot had never come from a badge at all. The parking lot did not empty after Ryan Mercer handed over his keys. If anything, it seemed to grow heavier, as though the night itself understood that consequence had only begun and was not yet finished. Lieutenant Marcus Hale stepped aside to log the chain of custody, while Captain Susan Keller spoke quietly into her phone, requesting dispatch records, camera preservation notices, and immediate copies of all incident-related communications. Mr. Harlan stood near the pharmacy entrance with his hands clasped so tightly in front of him that his knuckles had turned pale. Marisol remained by Evelyn Brooks, no longer unsure of where she belonged in the scene. She had made up her mind, and there was a steadiness in her now that had not been there before. Evelyn accepted the paper bag she had repacked for her and slipped the birthday card safely inside, flattening its bent corner one more time before closing the top. The gesture was so small, so ordinary, and yet it cut through the entire moment with heartbreaking clarity. Even after everything, she was still thinking about her grandson's birthday. Daniel Brooks noticed it too. He noticed everything. The way his mother kept her back straight, even though she was tired. The way she looked at people directly, not to challenge them, but to remind them she was still fully there. He also noticed something else, something that had been forming at the edges of the night ever since the witnesses began to speak. This was no longer just about a single officer making a disgraceful choice. It was about every person who had seen an elderly black woman struggling and treated that struggle as suspicion instead of humanity. Daniel turned toward the small crowd and asked a question no one expected. Who called me? He said. Tasha Reed raised her hand slowly. I did. Daniel nodded once and walked toward her. Thank you, he said, and the sincerity in his voice made her eyes widen for a second. You did what others should have done sooner. Tasha glanced down, then back at Evelyn. I almost did not, she admitted. I kept thinking somebody older, somebody official, would step in first. Evelyn looked at her with deep, tired kindness. But you did step in, she said softly. That matters. Imagine how many wrong things continue simply because decent people keep waiting for someone else to go first. Daniel let the silence after that breathe for a moment, because some truths deserve room. Then he turned back toward Captain Keller. I want a departmental review expanded beyond tonight, he said. Use this incident as the starting point. Pull prior complaints involving unnecessary escalation during low-level public calls, especially those involving elderly civilians. Check whether patterns were missed because they looked small one at a time. Ryan Mercer stared at him, stunned. He had expected discipline, maybe suspension, maybe public embarrassment. He had not expected the night to become a mirror aimed at the system around him. Chief, he said, his voice strained now. You are turning one misunderstanding into something political. Daniel faced him fully. No, he said. I am refusing to let a pattern keep hiding behind that word. Captain Keller gave a short nod. Understood. Marcus Hale wrote it down immediately. Mr. Harlan stepped forward then, his voice thin and uncertain. Chief Brooks, the store is willing to cooperate fully. We will provide footage and whatever else you need. Daniel looked at him for a long moment. You will also apologize to my mother, he said. Not because she is my mother, but because she was owed that before I ever arrived. Mr. Harlan swallowed hard and turned to Evelyn. His apology came out uneven, brittle with shame, but it was the first honest thing he had said all evening. Marisol followed with one of her own, quieter, more painful, because it came from someone who knew silence had cost something. Evelyn listened to both, then placed a gloved hand over the paper bag and said, I accept your apology. But next time, give a person a minute before you take their dignity. No one in the lot seemed able to look away from her after that. Daniel exhaled slowly, and the stern command in his face eased just enough for grief to show through. He opened the passenger door of his city vehicle, not insisting this time, just offering. Evelyn looked once more at the officers, the witnesses, the store windows, and Ryan Mercer standing stripped of certainty beneath the same lights he had once trusted. Then she turned back to her son and said, All right, Daniel, let us go home. Your nephew still needs his birthday card. And somehow, in that simple sentence, the entire night was measured correctly at last, not by power, not by humiliation, but by the quiet resilience of a woman who refused to let cruelty have the final word. Daniel helped Evelyn Brooks into the passenger seat with the same care she had once used to button his school coat on winter mornings. And for a moment, the parking lot fell into a strange kind of silence, the kind that comes after truth has already spoken and no one is brave enough to interrupt it. She settled the paper bag on her lap, placing one gloved hand over the birthday card inside, as if protecting something far more important than paper. Daniel closed the door gently, then stood beside the vehicle for one extra second with his hand resting on the frame, collecting himself. Across the lot, Lieutenant Marcus Hale continued taking statements under the wash of cold overhead lights. Captain Susan Keller was already speaking with dispatch, her voice steady and efficient as she set the machinery of accountability into motion. Mr. Harlan remained near the pharmacy entrance looking smaller than he had an hour earlier, while Marisol stood a few feet away with her hands clasped, her face changed by the kind of shame that sometimes becomes the beginning of conscience. Ryan Mercer had not moved much. He stood near the curb where Evelyn's cane had first fallen, no longer surrounded by authority, no longer protected by the performance of certainty. His patrol car was still there, but it no longer felt like his. His keys were gone. His explanations had thinned into nothing. And for the first time that night, he looked like a man forced to stand in the full light of his own choices. Daniel turned back toward him, not with fury, but with the final steadiness of a man who understood that justice becomes most powerful when it does not need to shout. He walked across the pavement until only a few feet separated them. Officer Mercer, he said, and Ryan lifted his eyes slowly. What happened here tonight will be reviewed in full. That is procedure. But procedure is not the lesson you should be afraid of forgetting. Ryan swallowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Daniel continued, his voice low and unwavering. You did not fail because you made one bad call. You failed because somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing people before you started judging them. My mother should not have needed my name to be treated with dignity. She should have had that from you the moment you saw her standing there." The words landed in the cold air and stayed there, because everyone close enough to hear knew they were larger than one parking lot, one store, one officer, one night. Imagine how different this country might feel if the elderly, the vulnerable, the overlooked, and the dismissed were given the same patience people reserve for power. Ryan looked past Daniel then, toward the passenger seat where Evelyn sat quietly beneath the dim interior light. She was not glaring at him. She was not celebrating what had happened to him. She was simply tired. And somehow that made everything worse. Daniel followed his gaze, and then said the one thing that would remain with Ryan longer than the suspension, longer than the investigation, longer than the paperwork Captain Keller was already preparing. "A badge does not make you honorable," Daniel said. "The way you treat someone who cannot do anything for you does." Ryan's mouth opened as if to answer, but nothing came. There was nothing left that could make him look better than the moment had already shown him to be. Daniel gave a small nod to Lieutenant Hale, then returned to the city vehicle and got behind the wheel. As the engine turned over, the dashboard light brushed softly across Evelyn's face. She looked out through the windshield at the pharmacy, at the witnesses, at the officers, at the cold little patch of pavement where her medicine had scattered, and then she looked at her son. "You did right," she said quietly. Daniel kept his hands on the steering wheel and stared ahead for a second before answering. "I am sorry I was not here sooner." Evelyn's expression softened with the deep patience of a woman who had lived long enough to know that love often arrives carrying guilt it does not deserve. "You came when it mattered," she said. Then, after a pause, she added, "Just promise me something." Daniel glanced at her. "Anything." She looked back toward the lights growing smaller in the side mirror. "Build a department that does not need a chief's mother to teach it how to see." Daniel nodded once, and that promise settled between them like something sacred. He eased the car out of the lot and onto the road, the pharmacy lights fading behind them, while inside the paper bag on Evelyn's lap the birthday card remained safe at last. Back in the parking lot, statements were still being written, footage was being secured, and a man who once mistook authority for righteousness was left standing beneath the cold glow of consequence. Because in the end, the night was never only about who Evelyn Brooks turned out to be. It was about who she had always been, a mother, a woman, a human being worthy of respect long before anyone important arrived. And that is how truth works when power forgets itself. It does not always crash through the door. Sometimes it rises slowly, picks up its cane, straightens its coat, and reminds the world that dignity was never supposed to be earned in the first place.